Thank you for Dr. Bijan for inviting me to this exciting webinar series. I'm in Tokyo, and I've heard it's really hot in Nagaland, and Tokyo is also pretty hot. It's like 38 degrees, I think, right now. Or, oh, it's not 35, so it's not as bad, I guess. So today I'm going to talk about voiceless nasals in Zhenzhongke, also called Butiam. Even though it's only my name that is listed on the program, this work is a collaborative endeavor with Celeste Guillaume at ICU. So what are voiceless nasals? First, let's listen to a sound from Zhenzhongke. This is a snippet of a sound. You probably heard the nga and then something else, like meh. And that's usually a sound that's described as voiceless nasals. And they are also called sometimes breathy nasals or aspirated nasals, depending on the literature. It seems that voiceless nasals are not really common, so they rarely occur in world languages. In the OPSIT database compiled by Madison, about 4% of the 451 languages list this voiceless nasal in their consonant inventory. So another interesting thing about voiceless nasals is even if a language may have a voiceless nasal, having contrastive voiceless nasal is reported to be rare by Ohala and Ohala in 1993. But it seems like it's not that rare because we find more and more languages with voiceless nasals, and Tibeto-Burman languages have this contrastive voiceless nasal, Hmong-Mien languages, Thai-Kadai languages, Hmong Khmer languages. And in Japan, there's a dialect spoken in Okinawa, an island called Miyako. And the dialect, Ikema dialect there also has voiceless nasal. It's probably the only dialect across the whole Japan that has voiceless nasal. So how do these voiceless nasals emerge? And in the case of Burmese, Ohala and Ohala says it comes from this historical S plus nasal sequence. So you can see that the S, the alveolar fricative, kind of loses its place, and then the frication noise combines or affects the realization of the nasal, which may result in a voiceless nasal sound. In Nishida 1975, actually the consonant clusters that are reported to trigger voiceless nasals in Burmese are known as S and G. Or like he reports both S and G, which is kind of interesting because the G that's voiced, if that's really triggers voiceless nasal, that might be something worth studying in the future. Voiceless nasals are also reported in Icelandic, and it comes from usually historical consonant clusters KN. So in English, the KN cluster, K is being deleted. So knife is knife, and knee is knee without the K sound. In these languages, you will have, in Icelandic, you have knivr or hne. And if you know a little bit of German, in German, knee, for example, is knee. So the K is still there, actually. So it seems like based on these studies, voiceless nasals historically seem to arise from some sort of source from an obstruent that basically loses its place. It becomes some kind of glottal feature, and the glottal feature affects the realization, surface realization of the nasal. So how many are all voiceless nasal the same? And Bhaskara and Ladefoget's study in 1991 basically reports two distinct types. And one thing is they both have similar kind of beginning, but they have different endings. The first type of voiceless nasals are type found in Burmese or Mizo. and Mizo is languages of the Northeast. And it seems like there is a two-step articulation that might happen. So you find some kind of glottis followed by some kind of voicing due to the nasal feature. A second type of voiceless nasal would be shown in Angami, another language in the Northeast. And it seems like in this language, we see merged articulation. So there's no, not necessarily clear separation between the glottal feature and the nasal, but continuous nasal airflow, usually with no visible voicing, and and then variation in the nasal airflow depending on the place of nasal. Not surprisingly. So let's look at these type. Thanks to some colleagues, Wendy and Wendy Planminglu, and was able to have some Mizo data. And this is an example of Mizo versus nasal. Male, you probably, it may be a little bit weak if your video is not set loud enough. Yeah. And then this is with the alveolar. What you can see here is in the beginning there's some kind of glorification, and then before the vowel you see the nasal sound that appears both in the labial versus nasal as well as in the alveolar versus nasal. So what's I'm sorry. What's happening here is in Burmese or Mizo, so Burmese has the same kind of type. The audio signal will look something like this, and then you get it will start with almost nothing or like a little bit of frication noise, and then before the vowel you will see the nasal continuing. So during the time of the articulation, the glottis is mostly open. So you get some sort of, not a lot, but the oral airflow. Nasal flow is peaking, so a lot of air is coming out of the nose. And voicing is at the end of the transition. So because there's a division between the glottal gesture and the nasal, basically, this type of articulation is described as two-step articulation. Let's listen to Angami type voices nasals. This is from Viazono Terhilya and Priyanka Sarma, again sharing the Angami data. Maybe the beginning is a little bit cut, so you may have been hearing a B-like sound. For some reason, the beginning is cut. That's why you are hearing the B or P. But the original sound file was a nasal sound. So here, unlike the Mizo cases, what you can see just before the vowel, there are no discernible voicing or clear voicing that's happening. And the frication noise and the nasal is basically produced simultaneously. Because of this type of nature of the articulation, it's called merged articulation. So one of the major difference between the two-step articulation is there's no clear voicing differences. So and sometimes because there's a release of the closure, the release of the closure, can mistakenly perceived as epenthetic plosive. So, given this background about voiceless nasals, the goal of today's talk is presenting you with an analysis, presenting you data from Zhengjongke and show what kind of acoustic properties we find, and also proposing a phonological representation associated with voiceless nasals. So Jenjongke is spoken in the Himalayas. So it's wedged between Bhutan and Nepal. And the bigger map here shows the state of Sikkim. So it's divided into 4 different areas: north, west, south, and east Sikkim. Jenjongke is also in the scheduled list of languages of India. It's listed as Bhutia, but it seems like they themselves prefer either, or like interchangeably, they use the term Jenjongke and Bhutia. Hloke is another term that they use, or in English literature, you might see the term Sikkimese. And all of these basically refer to the same type of language. Currently, there are about 80,000 speakers in Sikkim. So Jenjongke voiceless nasals are interesting because it seems that they are innovative in a sense that you don't find this voiceless nasal in neighboring languages such as Dzongkha or Tibetan. Dzongkha and Tibetan are closely related to Jenjongke, but you don't find this voiceless nasal. As far as we know, it doesn't seem to be the case that other studies looked at this particular group of sounds in detail. Descriptions, however, exist. So in Yiliniemi and George Van Driem's work, Jenjongke is reported to have 8 nasal phonemes, and these examples here comes from Yiliniemi, and it's listed like plus voice sounds are the nasal sounds that we know, and minus voice sounds are the voiceless nasals that we can think of. So mother and wund with 2 different tones, ma and ma, you get the voiced nasal, and ma, which means down or lower, you'd get the voiceless nasal. So what you can already see in these labial cases is for the voiced nasals, there's a tonal contrast that you can find in the vowel, which is not directly related to this study, but with the voiceless nasals, it's always followed with the high-pitched vowel. So that's why you don't see the tonal contrast or like contrastive pairs of words that begin with voiceless nasal. So we have also examples like here, ear, and nose. Na is here, na is ear, and hna is nose. And nim is son or day, and hnim is sister-in-law. Na is speech, and nga is speech, and nga is invocation. So there are other kind of restrictions that we find in Jenjongke voiceless nasals. They only seem to occur in word initial position. That's comparable with the Icelandic cases that Jesson and Pettersson report. In Yiliniemi, he describes these voiceless nasals as a voice segment preceded by some sort of voicelessness. And they're represented sometimes in this kind of way. So there's an M that's voiceless, followed by M that's voiced, or N that's voiceless, and followed by N that's voiced. And this kind of description, even though it's more based on the impressionistic kind of, even though he made recordings and didn't necessarily classify them in further, they may suggest that, it does suggest that Jenjongke voiceless nasals may belong to the first type that Bhaskara and Ladefoget reported, where there's 2-step articulation. So Jenjongke voiceless nasal might belong to a Burmese or Mizo type. So just as a reminder, this 2-step articulation was basically done in a way, so you have some kind of frication noise, and then just before the vowel, you will have some kind of voicing indicated or realized. So it matches with the description that Yiliniemi provided. So our data comes from field work in March 2019, conducted in Gangtok, Sikkim, And we have recordings. We collected recordings from 6 native speakers. And they were recorded pronouncing target words 5 times as part of a randomized list of words in a carrier sentence. And the carrier sentence was something like nga something lapdoing. So I say something. That's basically nga is I, and lapdoing is I'm saying or I say, something like that. Just as a note, because the Zhenjongke writing, which uses the Tibetan script, does not fully encode the voices nasal yet, what we did is we actually used English words, and then we asked all the participants to tell us what kind of words, these words, and in Zhenjongke, and usually the corresponding words, not usually, the corresponding words were the voices nasal words. And then after that, they were actually prompted with English meaning, and based on the English meaning, the Zhenjongke speakers produced the Zhenjongke words. On the right side here, you see a QR code. All the data that appear in this particular presentation can be downloaded from this website using the QR code. It's one of the ICO language database series, and in order to obtain all the recordings, you need to submit a request form. But once you submit a request form as free of charge, you will get a full set of data for you to make use of it. So here's a stimuli list. So we have words like me, na, be, no, nyap, na, nye, nik, nima, ale. So, and I went to the STAT, the Sino-Tibetan Etymological Dictionary in Thesaurus, and tried to map the Proto-Tibetan words. And in most cases, it seems like the Proto-Tibetan reconstructed words begin with some sort of an S. Sometimes I couldn't find any correspondence in the STAT, so I didn't list any, but it may suggest that at least some of the words in the Zhenjongke lexicon with voices nasal may also have the origin where the nasal was preceded by some sort of a fricative, in particular the alveolar fricative S. So the results was, if there were just one kind of results, it would be like, okay, results over, and my talk would be ending. But luckily, we don't find that simplistic results in our data set. So interestingly, we found 4 different patterns that speakers produced, and these variations, 4 different variations, appeared in the interspeaker as an interspeaker variation as well as intraspeaker variation. So one speaker may show this variation, as well as like across the speakers we see this variation. So the 4 types that we observed are these 4. So the first type is a voiceless nasal that belongs to type 1. That Pascararo and Ladefoguet recorded. It was also the type that was reported in Burmese and Mizo. And this voiceless nasal was also similar to the description that was done by Yeliniumi. So, however, some of the speakers in the production of the voiceless nasal words sometimes produce the words without the voiceless nasal. And sometimes the voiceless nasal that usually have the frication and the nasal would be producing the glottal frication, but the nasal was not separate. The nasality would only be in the, it's not a preceding vowel, it's the, yeah, it's only the following vowel. I'm sorry about this huge typo. It only appears on the following vowel. And sometimes we saw metastasis in the consonant portion, which means that the voiceless nasal that usually have fricative portion followed by the nasal would actually swap the two and will have the voiced nasal component preceding the glottal frication. So these were the 4 different types, which is surprising in a sense that if the voices nasals are strict category or like phonetically well-defined category for the Zhenjiangke speakers, we should expect more or less uniformed way of realization of these sounds. However, it seems like when the speakers were producing a target word that contains a voices nasal, they ended up showing variable realization. So here's the first pattern. This is like the usual mesotype pattern. And here's an example. You heard this in the beginning of today's talk. So this is basically the mesotype. All examples are produced in the frame sentence. So you hear sometimes nga, and this particular case, the verb was cut. But in other examples, you may hear the verb laptoing. So the second type is the nasal, just the nasal sound without the voices. So there's no more the typical that we expect in the production of the voices nasal. The third pattern was retaining the frication. But the nasalization, the nasal part was, instead of being a separate or independent kind of signal, the speakers would produce the following vowels as nasal. The vowel is what you see as a production. And then interestingly, the most common pattern for this voices nasal was actually the pattern that we least expected. So you may hear some kind of plosive sound because of the burst that you see here. And this pattern basically is interesting because here now the voice part of the voices nasal is preceding or is followed by the voices part. And this is opposite to what Yeleniemi reported. But bear in mind, please keep in mind that what Yeleniemi in 2019 reported is the first pattern that I showed earlier. So it exists. However, speakers may also produce pattern that was in a reverse phonetic realization. So this is this kind of metastasis is kind of, maybe we thought about this and like what is really going on in this kind of cases, and it may have resulted from the resyllabification. So you have some kind of sonority target, and you don't really want to have the H and then an M, but you prefer to have the M, or like maybe you Zhenjiangke allows very limited number of codas, but the nasal codas are definitely more of a norm than a fricative coda. So they may have been the effect of the production in a frame sentence may have triggered this kind of metastasis, basically. So this is the 4 patterns. So voices nasal, or the voices nasal as a 2-step articulation, voices nasal but no fricative, just the nasal, voices nasal produced with the nasalization on the following vowel, or voices nasal that display metastasis pattern. In Bascararo and Ladefoguet in 1991, they have an interesting segment in their article. They said, despite the small voice portion in most phonological treatments of these sounds, this is a quote from their article, a voiceless nasal consonant is considered not as a sequence of two items, a voiceless segment followed by a voice segment, but as a single voiceless unit with a low-level phonetic rule inserting the voicing towards the end. And if you follow the two-step or the articulate acoustic model or acoustic realization of the voiceless nasal, it makes kind of sense. So phonologically, they suggest, Bascararo and Ladefoguet suggest that voiceless nasals are single unit. That's not that surprising. But how can we then represent these voiceless nasal phonologically? And that would be the second part of today's talk. So there are two types of phonological features that may represent voiceless nasal. It's called voiceless nasal. So maybe it's a nasal followed by a minus voice, or not followed. Minus voice and nasal are basically associated together with this particular segment, and they result in voiceless nasal. Or in fact, there's an alternative to this minus voice idea, and the alternative is maybe it's a spread glottis that makes this kind of, that generates the voiceless nasals that we do. So is it minus voice or spread glottis? First, let me introduce a little bit about spread glottis in case you're not familiar with this feature. It was first proposed in Halle and Stevens. So it was this particular feature is one of the major or like the basic laryngeal gesture that Halle and Stevens proposed along with the voice feature as well as the constricted glottis feature. So in spread glottis situation, the laryngeal gesture, the vocal cords during that spread glottis feature. Okay, the definition of spread glottis is something like the vocal cords is moving outward of the position for voicing. And then because the vocal cord is moving outward, what happens is there's a relatively larger glottal opening. And then when in those kind of cases, because there's already space in the glottis or a relatively larger space in the glottis than the usual voicing, now the glottal vibration is slackening. So you get something like a breathy voice or aspiration. So the phonetic realization of spread glottis feature is basically what we know as aspirated obstruents or H or the breathy vowels or breathy segments. So how can we then represent the variable realization of the phonological voiceless nasal? Before moving on to the feature kind of idea, we need to introduce some kind of representation. And this is the full representation that we are introducing. So when it's faithfully realized, we are just going to use the IPS symbol that add the circle on the nasal to mark the voiceless nasal. The second type was when the voiceless nasal is not showing any frication noise or any voicelessness part. So in those cases, we just mark it with the N without the circle underneath. This is when the previous vowel is, why is it the previous vowel? The following vowel is nasalized. And this is the case where you, the fourth one is the case where you see the metastasis of the features. So when you see the first three different types, the faithful realization, deletion of the laryngeal feature, or the laryngeal feature shift to a vocalic segment, actually either minus voice feature or spread glottis feature will do the job. Like there won't be much problem in explaining the situation, circumstances, the realization of the voiceless nasal. However, when we see the fourth type where the metastasis happen, we want to argue that it's spread glottis rather than minus voice that has an advantage in explaining this situation. So Maybe what is happening is the voice is nasal. The representation also has some kind of ordering relationship, and then we can actually just switch the ordering between the features in order to account for these metastasis cases. So if voices nasal are specified with spread glottis, what we can just simply do is the metastasis is the switching of the order between the nasal feature and the spread glottis feature. However, let's entertain the idea that voices nasals are specified with minus voice. Then if minus voice is there, this H itself should be a placeless voice, a minus voice, because H lacks any place. And if that's the case, somehow the place feature needs to be maintained, and after that, the frication part loses its place feature. So for the economy of phonological processes, adding minus voice, even though in most cases minus voice and spread glottis will not make a difference in terms of the prediction, for the metastasis cases, it seems like minus voice would add another extra step for the phonological system to deal with. And well, you might say like one is not bad, but one more step is one more step. So maybe if you have to choose between these two kind of processes or like methods of explanation, spread glottis might be a way to go. However, it does not mean that Seunghun does not utilize the minus voice, or maybe it does. One of the things that we want to think about briefly is the plosive contrast in Seunghun. Seunghun has four-way plosive contrast, which is also found in other Indo-Aryan languages in the area. So there's a voiceless, plosive, aspirated, voiced, and something called devoiced. And it seems like the devoiced one is where we definitely need the spread glottis. And traditionally, the distinction would have been like voiceless consonant is minus voice, aspirated is maybe just spread glottis without minus voice, and voiced consonant would have plus voice, and devoiced consonant would be plus voice and spread glottis. If we get rid of minus voice, we still actually, from the system of Seunghun, well, that's kind of assume that voice is a privative feature in this case, but it still can account for this plosive contrast. So perhaps minus voice is completely absent in Seunghun phonology, or we need both minus voice and spread glottis. At least for the voices nasal cases, I would argue that, or we would argue, spread glottis is a better way to go. So let me just briefly move on to articulatory phonology to account for this voices nasal from a slightly different angle. So we had a representational look at the voices nasal, and we entertained the idea of what is responsible for the voicelessness. Is it really minus voice feature, or is it spread glottis? And we argued that it would be spread glottis, or spread glottis would be more economic to explain the situation. In articulatory phonology now, gestures are being used to model several phonological processes. So in articulatory phonology, the change in the timing between articulations and the magnitude is what's important to consider. And gestures are basically the core unit in the thinking in terms of articulatory phonology. And gestures, the definition of gestures are as follows. These are events that unfold during speech production and whose consequences can be observed in the movements of the speech articulators. So, and these kind of gestures can be used to represent utterance in phonological ways. So it focuses more on this non-discrete nature of the speech that we are producing, because the articulators do not go in a discrete manner. They move in a very non-discrete way, but our phonology perceives these non-discrete gestures as discrete segment. So how can we then account for these variations in voiceless nasal? So in each of these long elongated graphs or like figures that you can see, on the left side, you will see 5 lines. VIL stands for velic aperture. This is like the lowering of the velum to open up the passage to the nasal cavity. So the velic aperture gesture is needed if you want a nasal sound. Then TT is the tongue tip gesture. TB is tongue body. Lips are lips gesture. And GLO stands for the glottal aperture. So for the vowels, we are going to just mark the gesture as a tongue body gesture. And what you need to focus now is on the velic aperture and the glottal aperture in order to account for this. So the tradition, the standard way of thinking about mesotype could be the velic gesture that is responsible for the nasal consonant can occur together with the glottal gesture. So the glottal gesture has a higher magnitude, and as a result, we don't see much of the nasal signal, but towards the end, when the glottal gesture stops being operating, what happens is the nasal gesture appears more strongly, and we see the voicing of the nasal. So this is the mesotype case. The second variation was there's no fricative kind of situation. And what would happen here is we just see the no gesture that is associated with the glottal aperture, but like the velic aperture is open, so you get a nasal sound only. So the third variation would be, yeah, I have to double check the data about the preceding versus following because everything is preceding. So so the nasal gesture, yeah, it must be preceding. I'm sorry about the earlier part. It's the preceding vowel that's being nasalized. And so the nasalized vowel, the vowel gesture, the tongue body gesture responsible for the vowel, and the nasal gesture is overlapping, and that's how you get the nasalized vowel. And the H appears somewhere later, and that's why, however, the nasal gesture is still there. In the metastasis cases, the nasal gesture is there, the velic aperture gesture is there, but it does not overlap with the vowel, and as a result, you get the metastasis situation. So in this particular case, what we can see here is either the velic aperture gesture and the glottal gesture can appear together, or you can have a nasal without the glottal aperture, or the nasal, the velic aperture gesture is realized earlier than the glottal aperture. So either together or earlier, but you never see it afterwards. So this gesture model basically give you an interesting asymmetry, as I just said, that the velic aperture gesture has to precede the glottal gesture, but it cannot really follow it. And that seems like an interesting restriction that Jandrongke seems to display or demonstrate. And maybe there's a constraint in Jandrongke, a gestural constraint, that velic gesture must precede the glottal opening. And because of the restrictive gesture, when they happen to overlap, that's when you get the voiceless nasal. I'm sorry. So one of the interesting thing then it emerges from this kind of pattern is if phonetic realization of multiple gestures are random, where velic aperture responsible for nasal and glottalic aperture responsible for the frication noise or H is randomly aligned, then we should be able to see languages displaying NH sequences and HN sequences in an equal kind of manner. So we predict pre-aspiration or like brassiness preceding the vowel and like all this thing, brassiness preceding the pre-aspirated nasal or something like that all over the place. But it seems like we have some kind of a symmetry that we predict that comes from the Zhenzhongke variation, where we saw the difference between the timing difference between the glottal and the nasal, where there's a bias against having spread glottis versus nasal sequence. Let me just briefly show you. So you can have a nasal and then a spread glottis, but not spread glottis and then nasal. At most, you can have a simultaneous nasal and spread glottis gesture. That's basically what we can think of. So is this bias against spread glottis nasal something that can be contributed to only Zhenzhongke, or do we see any kind of cross-linguistic patterns? And next two slides are exploring that. And interestingly, in English, there are no total syllabic HN sequences. That's absent. You can sometimes find unhealthy or unhappy kind of sequences where the NH are appearing next to each other and the N, but morpheme boundary is required in usually this case. In French cases, H is absent. However, French has a lot of fricatives, and interestingly, again, spread glottis nasal sequence like fricative followed by a nasal clusters are not allowed. It's a SN and SN. French speakers may have SN or SM clusters. However, those are only like English loanwords, like small, for example. Oh, mind you, please, when I say total syllabic spread glottis nasal sequence, I hear when I refer to the spread glottis in English, I limit myself to H only. Of course, in English, you can have small, smell, and snail, all these different sequences with an S, but HN sequence is not allowed. In French, H is apt. However, there are some kind of restrictions that we can find between the fricative nasal clusters when they're considered, because in the native French words, fricative nasal clusters are absent. Nasal followed by a fricative are existing, but it seems like similar to English kind of restriction. Bonne soirée, the spelling has an E, but the pronunciation just ends with an N sound. And bonne soirée has an N followed by an S, but you need a word boundary in order to have this sequence realized. In Japanese, again, no H plus nasal sequences are found. And that's not surprising because H is not a coda that's allowed in Japanese. However, even NH has some kind of limit in a sense. It can occur only across morpheme boundaries, like choong means ultrasound, and the ultrasound wave is ha. So you can get a situation in Japanese where N is followed by an H. Interestingly, the N followed by an H would never be realized as N followed by an H. So you won't find Chongha in Japanese, but this H has to change to a P. So Chongpa is how you get the pronunciation. So there's something about this nasal spread sequences that you can find. In Korean, there's also something interesting. The H that occurs between nasals or sonorants, they are always deleted. So underlying H here, when you have a vowel suffix that following it, this H is deleted. However, this H is not deleted when it follows a plosive. So when you have a plosive coda like pap, followed by the numeral hana, one, it gets you one bowl of rice. And the pronunciation is not pabana, but papana. Yeah. So what we've seen in English, French, Japanese, and Korean is, yes, it seems like nasal spread glottis clusters, if they exist, they have to be nasal followed by spread glottis, but not the other way around, suggesting there's some kind of bias against spread glottis. And sometimes you even see active change of segments in order to minimize any situation where the H is following or preceding or sonorant or nasal kind of sound. So our voiceless nasal, quarreless sounds or single target. And so quarreless sound meaning there are two segments realized as one, but they can be divided. Remember that Pascararo and Ladefoguet said like, oh, they're just single target, basically. And maybe it is, but if they are not, actually, I don't think we should be able to find the variation that we reported here, that we found in voiceless nasal. So we think that perhaps phonetic target is there, and if you just look at the phonetic, it might suggest that these voiceless nasals are just like a single target. But once you look at this variation and different kind of patterns, it's maybe this phonetic variation that we found suggests that there's some division that phonologically can be made. At least, if not Mizo or Angami, at least in Jenjonke speaker's mind, voiceless nasal might seem to be quarreless sounds. And perhaps this reflects any diachronic changes that we find. So I'm not gonna talk about the other one. And yeah, I think, yeah, I maybe talk too much, but there's no unique phonetic realization of voiceless nasal in Jenjonke. That's what I've been saying. And what all these patterns have in common is that nasality is maintained. So nasality is there. But in addition to nasality and spread glottis, what we found is it seems like when if you adopt a gestural phonology, articulatory phonology kind of viewpoint, nasal has to precede the V-lick gesture, has to precede the glottal gesture, or they can co-occur. And the stereotypical voiceless nasal is basically a co-occurrence of the V-lick gesture and the glottal gesture. And Jenjonke seems to have a gestural constraint where a glottal gesture cannot precede the V-lick gesture. And this kind of asymmetry in the directionality seem to be found also cross-linguistically when we look at languages like English, French, Japanese, or Korean. So this work has been funded by multiple people and some selected references and Tsuji-Shen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very comprehensive presentation encapsulating so many different aspects and languages. It was a very absorbing and engaging session, and I'm sure that all of us have learned a lot from your presentation. Now, I request if anyone has any questions or answers, sorry, any questions towards the speaker, to kindly put up your hands or send it on or to me privately.
I think Tamsu raised his hand.
Okay. Yes. Can you hear us? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Seunghun, for that interesting presentation. Yeah, I think voiceless nasals in general is, I think, an interesting topic. I think much because of the number of variations or varied things that you see in the literature, and also what you have shown with regard to Renjongke. Now, just a comment that this patterns that you see in Renjongke, whether it is a case of some language change taking place, shift from older speakers to younger speakers. So I don't know what your native speakers, their age group was. So if there's a difference between the older speakers and younger speakers in these patterning of the four patterns that you showed, that's because even in Ao, which has these voiceless nasals, as well as, in fact, voiceless sonorants, there is this tendency of uh, the voiceless nasals changing to splitting. So something like ma, nasal would go into the preceding syllable. So you have and then next syllable, you have actually a glottal fricative, he, right? So me would actually change to he. And this is, you see a lot in especially younger speakers, where there seems to be a change from voiceless nasals to just retaining voice plus maybe the fricative. And this is interesting because I think you've also shown one of the patterns where nasalization actually goes preceding, not to the following. And that I saw that as an interesting thing taking place. So yeah, always I think favored spread glottis instead of um, voiceless, right? So I think I mean pre-aspirated seems to be a more relevant, at least in the languages that we know of. And this is interesting because I think many of the Naga languages have these voiceless nasals, and I think many of the participants here would have learned a lot in this talk. So yeah, just that comment and the parallel between what we see in Renjongke and even in some of the younger out speakers who have these voiceless nasals in their speech. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Tamsu. The age group of the participants were relatively similar. There were no young speakers. They were about 30s or something like that, in their 30s. And also there were intra-speaker variation. So one speaker might have these four different types of variation. But it's really interesting that you said the OWL, younger speakers are producing actually some kind of what I call metastasis pattern, where the M and the H appears in sequence, because I think many people might just assume ma would become ma because you don't have ma, but many languages have just a nasal, voice nasal. But instead of going from ma to ma, actually people are decomposing and metastasizing the nasal gesture and the H gesture. And then maybe after that, the H is lost, like a Korean case where the H is lost between the sonorants. That might happen in the future. And that ended up being a resyllabification, again, the M becoming the onset of the next sound. So that may happen in the future. One interesting thing about a little part that I skipped is one of the word in Renjongke that has the voices nasal is ngabu, which means pillow. And the same word in Zonka is hangbu. And the only, if Ngabu became Hangbu, then it kind of is against what we assume, what I assumed so far, because now the nasality is going past the vowel and become a coda of the next one. So it could also be the case that Hangbu, in Hangbu, A and Ng are actually metastasizing, and then the Ng becomes our onset. It seems like too much metastasis going on all over the place. But what I think is interesting is like these voices nasal are usually kind of like, oh, it's rare, it's like this, and this is it. And actually there are a lot of more things that can be studied. And the direction of the, if the ma is becoming mha, it also suggests what kind of language direction, language change that might happen. Maybe it's in the progress and it's an unstable sound because, in fact, until some of the speakers who are really into the conservation of their own language, they themselves were also not, they said when they were younger, they didn't realize they had this nasal sound that are produced with the H. So, because it's not in the writing. The Tibetan writing does not have a voiceless nasal writing, and as a result, they never even thought about this. But then when some people started pointing it out to them, they realized, yes, actually we have it. And then they realized we don't just have it, we have many of them. So probably they have more words with that. And it would be interesting to trace. And if you study the language further, maybe the younger speakers may show a similar pattern like the Ao speakers. And I don't think many Jenjonke speakers have a regular contact with Ao speakers. I don't know whether you know many Jenjonke people. So it's an interest, if the same kind of diachronic change is found in the next 10, 15 years amongst the younger speakers, then it would be an interesting way to describe these voices nasals in a more like systematic, I would say, or learned method in order to understand what's going on or what might go on. Yeah. I hope I answered. I think it was mostly comments, right? And yeah.
Thank you, Tim, sir, for your astute observation. And now I think Sir Potong has a question. Sir?
Yeah. Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So my question is a very general one. So in languages which have both voiceless and voice nasals, what are the acoustic or what called phonetics evidence? Do you have any acoustic or phonetic evidence to show or not to show that the voiceless nasals are the original form, or the nasals the nasals were the original form? So when it comes to language history, we are given, or at least I am given to understand that perhaps in languages of the Kuki-Chin, which have both voiceless as well as voice nasals, the voiceless nasals are the protoforms, and the nasals are the later derivation. I am not very clear on that front. But my question is very simple. So what are the acoustic evidence to show or not to show that which one is the earlier form, whether the voicelessness derives from the voice ones or vice versa? That is one aspect of my question. The next is, there has been often confusion as to whether aspiration. Here you do not deal with lateral. So we have the counterpart of voicelessness of nasal is we have voiceless lateral and we have a voiceless rhotic. So at times, because we don't deal very deep at the phonetic level, so based on perceptual level, most of these what you call voiceless lateral and rhotics tend to be perceived or conceived as aspirated lateral and aspirated rhotic. Thank you.
Oh, okay. What? Okay. So going back to the first one, I don't think you can actually have phonetic evidence to find the historic origin. So that's something that we need to look at, comparing, I believe, comparing like surrounding languages or different forms in other languages in order to understand that. So phonetic evidence itself will not tell us, as far as I know, which one is fundamentally there or which one was derived later on. However, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, I think you were just joining at the time, or like maybe I skipped it too quickly at the time. But most of these languages, when they have voiceless nasals, as far as I know, the historical form usually some kind of a fricative or a plosive before the nasal. So none of them just have ma from the beginning, it seems, when they're historically reconstructed. So I'm actually interested in your description of Kukichin, where you said voiceless nasal is seen as diachronically, historically more basic, and then the voice forms is seen as derived, because that would be a fairly different type of language compared to the languages that are commonly reported when people talk about the diachrony of voiceless nasal. In a sense that in other languages, it has been mostly reported there was an S or K sound before the voices, before the nasal, and then the loss of the place of articulation resulted in a voiceless nasal kind of situation. But if I understood you correctly, Kukichin may have been a language where there was already like just the voiceless nasal without any trigger from an S. So it would be, I'd be interested in learning more about this. Maybe not right now, but after later on, like I will get your contact from Priyanku. It seems like you know Priyanku, so so I will do that. And second, it's a good question that you asked about voiceless lateral and voiceless rhotic. Interestingly, in Jajongke, they also have the voiceless lateral and voiceless rhotic, and Tibetan has it too. So this voiceless lateral, fl and th, these are written. So they knew it. They have a writing system or like letters associated with these sounds. So I didn't do a systematic study, but I have a I have this hunch that they may not show this kind of wild variation in the pronunciation of those sounds. However, it'll be interesting to look at, and if they show this kind of variation, that would again be interesting, because we could generalize now this variation happening across all sonorants, rather than just with the voiceless nasals. So thank you about raising that issue. So you gave me homework, so I have to go and look it up. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Priyanku?
Yeah. Seunghun, very interesting work. And then I have lots of questions. In fact, I had questions on slide number 16, 20, and 21, which I cannot see now. But anyways, I'll just go ahead with some other questions. First of all, just what you mentioned just now to, oh yeah, thank you. Can you go to slide number 20? And before that, like, when you just talked about, like, the written system of Denzongke, what I observed is that when they wrote the voiceless nasals, they actually wrote another consonant with the nasal, right?
Yeah, if they write it now, when they write it now, they add a little prefix to the nasal.
Okay.
Oh, but actually these prefixes should be careful because they are used for the tonal marking actually, not for voices nasal necessarily. Yeah.
I saw one the and ma together probably. That was very surprising for me.
Yeah.
Anyways, so
Anyway,
that is another issue.
we will look it up later. Yeah.
Right. Another the question that I have is that actually can there be a voiceless nasal without the ha part? Be it like be it aspiration, be it a complete ha vowel. Can there be a voiceless nasal without the ha part?
So you mean just with the nasal? Is that what you mean?
A voiceless nasal without the preceding ha or following ha.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can call it a voiceless nasal, but that's why this was surprising because if voiceless nasal, this is slide 18, and this is a second pattern that I mentioned, and I didn't mention in detail because if voiceless nasal is really a category that requires the voicelessness in here, so we should not expect this kind of realization of the sound that we find, because this is what Priyanka just asked, like a voiceless nasal without any H sound. And that's, how can you even call it a voiceless nasal, right? So if somebody just produced, if I just happen to record one speaker who happened to say this in this way, I would have said like, oh, there's no voiceless nasal in this in this language. But because the speaker was actually producing voiceless nasal in other occasion, but this it could have been a speech error, who knows? But at least it was not just one instance, and that's why it was interesting to do. And this relates to Professor Hawkins' talk about Kukichin, I guess, like, because is it like more can the because diachronic changes can also happen in multiple way, I think. And Temsu gave us this owl cases where the voiceless nasal is decomposed and then you have a nasal followed by an H, but also perhaps in Kukichin languages is the voiceless nasal becoming immediately voiced without having any of this decomposition. And that suggests, phonologically perhaps, in Kukichin languages, as Pascararo and Ladefoget said, these voiceless nasal are just single unit in these speakers' minds. They do not think this can be separated as a phonological representation even. So that's why you ended up having this counterpart as the derived from voiceless nasal become a voice nasal, whereas in the owl cases where Temsu said, they might be more like Genjongke, where the voiceless nasal might have phonologically branched representation in speakers' mind. And we cannot actually ask speakers, right? Do you treat this with two features or do you treat it with one feature? So these kind of evidence may indirectly suggest that some interesting passage can occur in the history of voiceless nasals. I hope I addressed some of your.
Yeah, but another concern that I have here is that, because see, like, when we are looking into these kind of voiceless nasals, and if we look into the nasal airflow, then we see that there's a continuous nasal airflow from the beginning to the end, but the oral airflow is not always consistent. For example, in the middle of the production of the voiceless nasal, we will see that when the aspiration occurs, there is an oral airflow, which goes really high. Right. So what I'm trying to ask you is that H, the ha, be it an aspiration, be it a completely separate, assumed as a separate consonant, is it actually a part of the nasal, voiceless nasal or not? And is that the reason why that this is underspecified and there is a little bit of leeway which is allowed in the production of the ha, whether in the preceding the nasal or the following the nasal? That is one question I had. In some languages, maybe it has completely settled down into being in the preceding case, preceding the nasal part or the following the nasal part. But in most of the cases, probably the idea is that the airflow is so large that the air column cannot be completely expelled by the nasal cavity probably. And that is the reason why people are opening them, the people are actually realizing these aspiration or the ha sounds in the production of the voiceless nasals.
Yeah, I think it's possible. Let me just answer it that way.
Right.
It's possible, and especially when there's a lot of airflow already coming out of the oral cavity, and then you get this H kind of gesture. So we have limited lung capacity, so the airflow, we don't have unlimited lung capacity, of course. So if there are lots of airflow coming out of the oral cavity, there's not a lot of room for the air to come out of a nasal cavity.
Right.
A lot of things left. So, but what seems to be real is at least when people produce this kind of sequence of sounds, speakers of a native language with these kind of sounds, they would actually perceive it as a single unit, and they know it's different from ma. That seems to be the case, because if they were thinking, oh, it's just like ma and not really ma as a single unit, then it would be, yeah, if they always think it as a sequence of two sounds, we probably wouldn't even describe it as a voiceless nasal at this point, right? If it's phonologic, if the phonological reality somehow prevents all human language speakers to treat that as a single unit. And however, that's not the case. We know many languages, especially in the Northeast, and the many Tibeto-Burman languages or like languages throughout the Southeast Asia, they utilize the sound, and the speakers actually are aware of the realization of the sounds. No matter what realization it is, they have it as a phonological category in their mind, and that needs to be separated from the regular voice nasal sound. So I think that's why I guess we need more detailed phonetic studies about these variations. And I think your project on Mizo and Angami are addressing those kind of issue, and perhaps Temsu is also sometimes looking at this kind of situation. And in the absence of like more systematic detail, like we have few very good papers on voiceless nasals, but if you compare it with the VOT studies, there are thousands of studies on voice onset timing, but voiceless nasal, probably we don't see that many studies that are comprehensive. So most studies will allow us to understand the nature of the sound, and only at that point we can perhaps have more confident view towards phonological representation of these sounds. Because now I have a strong, I strongly believe that it's probably spread glottis rather than minus voice. And actually naming it voiceless can be pretty misleading because people would immediately think this is a minus voice feature that's associated with it. However, this is based on modern language that I looked at, and also it uses some kind of like, selection by elimination, right? So this is a little bit more complicated, so that's why I use the spread glottis. But fortunately, the cross-linguistic comparison allowed us to think a little bit more, because if it was just minus voice, we don't see this kind of gesture restrictions in all these different languages. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Otan, sir? Otan, sir, I think you had raised your hand.
1 second. Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Now you are not.
Hello, sir.
Your microphone is off.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, sorry for that interruption. Okay, to continue with Priyanku's question, and I would like to throw a very wild question because I don't have the kind of expertise that you have. So I would like to go for the development of voicelessness, keeping spread glottis as the basis rather than the devoicing or minus voice. So if spread glottis, which is what you call articulatorily more easier form, if spread glottis is what you call is more phonetically viable form of explaining the derivation of voicelessness in languages that have it, then what stops other languages not to have voicelessness? Because spread glottis is something that is phonologically very viable. So some languages do develop them, whereas other languages don't have. So can you enlighten me, or whether spread glottis is something that that is the opposite of what I try to project it? So my projection of spread glottis is that it is a very viable phonetic articulatory forms that any speaker of any language can do so. So in languages which don't have, what prevents them from not developing voicelessness or other voiceless features? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, I have to clarify myself. I didn't mean to say that spread glottis is the only thing that exists, and spread glottis leads to minus voice. That's not what I said. That's why I think the term voiceless nasal can trigger confusion, because when I said spread glottis with nasal, in order to describe voiceless nasal, I cannot start calling it spread glottis nasal, right? Because nobody will understand what I say. I have to keep using the term. However, what in reality might be going on is the spread glottis feature is combined with the nasal feature in order to generate these kind of sound. That means that does not mean that we can get rid of the voice feature. Voice feature is still needed. All vowels are voice, so no language will be just having spread glottis, right? So you need the voice feature for sure. Then the next question is, do we need the minus voice feature? So is the voice feature actually binary, or is it privative? Can the absence of voicing be the voicelessness? That's more relevant, I think, in this kind of cases. So, and for voiceless nasals, you can't get rid of the minus voice if your system does not have spread glottis. You cannot just say, oh, I'm just going to call it nasal, because, well, then it becomes a nasal. It's not a voiceless nasal anymore. So we need something else if we want to get rid of minus voice from the feature system to describe a particular language. In the case of Zhenzhongke, I think there might be some other kind of evidence that mounts that points towards the case that perhaps the most economic system feature a system to account for the plosive contrast as well as these voices nasal, voices lateral, voices rhotic contrast might be the spread glottis instead of minus voice. But please remember that even in that case, the voice plus voice or voice feature has to be there, because otherwise we cannot distinguish between P and B. It will be just become identical if we, and they are all minus spread glottis. So if spread glottis has plus minus. So that's something that I would do. And but in the wild world, let's say there's no voice feature and spread glottis of everything, then we should, in fact, this is hypothetical. So think of a Disneyland. This is hypothetical that this is not going to happen. But if human language only has spread glottis and not voice, then it means, like as you just suggested, it will predict that basically all languages should have aspiration versus unaspirated contrast, if that's really the major thing. However, we cannot go that route since, as you probably throughout your research have noticed, no language, it's not, we cannot just say all languages have aspirated, unaspirated contrast. Many languages actually have voice contrast as well, which means that we need that particular feature in our understanding of the phonological system related to the consonant contrast. I hope that addresses some of your concern with the spread glottis. We couldn't hear you if you were talking. Yeah. I think you are talking, yeah, but we cannot hear you.
That answers my question. Sorry, there were lots of call and I in between I could not. Okay, that answers my question. The rest I will email you. Okay, we can have a later discussion on that. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah.
So if there are no other questions, and I guess we can move forward. Thank you, sir, and thank you everyone for your engaging inputs. Such an interactive session is invigorating and inspiring, you know, and it acts as a fodder to even our most latent academic musings. So on that note, we're going to proceed to the next speaker, who is our